Good morning, and welcome to the Leavitt webinar on information reporting. My name is Lisa Klinger. I'm one of the benefits attorneys at the Leavitt Group, and today is March 9th, 2016. Okay, good. Seems like everyone can hear me now, so that's good. As the initial announcement told you, all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you want to ask a question, please type it in the box that's probably on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll try to check for questions every so often. We didn't post a copy of the PowerPoint beforehand, but if you want one, please request a copy from your Leavitt advisor afterward, and the person who sent you the invitation to the webinar, I'm sure they want to follow up with you. So, and we are recording the webinar. So there we go. I'll get started. The agenda, why is this so confusing? Then I'll go over some of the due dates and the penalties. Then we'll talk about employer size briefly, and then I'll go through a lot of different scenarios, really based on a lot of the questions I've been getting from clients recently. And if I don't cover your question, then please ask it. And then I'll talk a little bit about the difference on insured and self-funded and how that affects reporting. And I'm going to go through a lot of the 1095C coding first, and then there's some specific 1094C questions. And of course, my favorite cartoon that I always include. It's amazing that there's actually a cartoon that deals with 1095C reporting. But Kat Burt, the evil director of human resources, says, "Today I will teach you how to fill out the 1095C form for the Affordable Care Act. Just randomly check boxes and hope no one ever notices." I've been doing that for years, and it's a huge time saver. But of course we know that really Kat Burt hasn't been doing it for years, because this is the first year that it's required, and probably people would notice if you did it, or it wouldn't be people so much as the IRS electronic information reporting system that would notice. So that would be a problem. So anyway, why is this topic so confusing? Well, there are a number of reasons. Partly it's because often your payroll vendors or your ACA information reporting vendors are saying, ask your broker. And we were doing webinars the last 2 years saying, you know, don't ask your broker, don't ask your insurance carrier. This is information you need to get from your payroll vendor or from your ACA information reporting vendor. But so a lot of times you've purchased the system, you've got this electronic software doing it, but then the question comes up, well, should this code be 2C or 2D, or should this be 1I or 1A? And so often the response you're getting is, well, we can't give you legal advice. You need to ask your broker. So hopefully I can answer some of those questions today. Also, another reason it's so confusing is that information reporting is new this year. It's the first year. So for everyone, there's a lot of confusion on issues, and for the IRS too, because sometimes they've changed their answers on things, particularly how you code it for continuing employees who are on COBRA, and they had one set of instructions first and then a different set in the final instructions, and then they revised it on the Q&As on their website, and now they've withdrawn the answer on their website and said it's under reconsideration. So some of the things, it just takes a while to get the bugs worked out. Also, there are sometimes glitches in the vendor's system, because this is the first year that it's in effect. So they're doing workarounds or telling you you can manually override it if you want. And then a fourth thing is the due dates have been delayed, but the penalties have been increased. So it's sometimes confusing as to, well, so when is this actually due? So real quickly, the delayed due dates for the 1095C to employees, the current due date is March 31st, 2016. It was going to be February 1st, but it was delayed to March 31st. And then for the filing with the IRS, if you're doing it electronically, That was initially going to be due March 31st. Now it will be June 30th, 2016. And if you're doing hard copy filings, that due date is May 31st. So you do still have some time, but you don't have much time left for that March 31st due date. The increased penalty amounts, and these are penalty amounts not just for the 1094 and 1095s, but for other information tax forms that have to be filed also. So it was $100 per form that you don't, 1095C that you don't provide or 1094 that you don't file, but now it's $250. The annual cap on penalties was $1.5 million, but now it's $3 million. And there's a lower cap for entities or employers with gross receipts of not more than $5 million. But that was $500,000, and now it's $1 million. So there are certainly penalties that could apply. However, there's a lot of different transition relief under the law. And one of the types of transition relief is for penalties. So this is reporting penalties. This isn't transition relief on the 4980H penalties, the employer mandate penalties. So this is just penalties on information reporting. And the good thing is the IRS has said that it will not issue an inaccuracy penalty for filings for the 2015 year if the filing is made in good faith. There's a good faith effort to comply. So, and there are two types of penalties. There's inaccuracy penalty, or there's late or non-filing penalties. So the late and non-filing penalties could still apply, but there won't be inaccuracy penalties. So if you put a code 2D and it should have been a code 2C, you won't have a penalty for that. But you do have to make a good effort to comply. However, as I said, the other type of penalty still does apply for late filing if there's no reasonable cause, or failure to file at all and no reasonable cause, or if it's inaccurate information and you did not make a good faith effort, like the Catbird, the evil HR director, who just randomly checks boxes. Even if that was inaccurate, you wouldn't be subject to the relief, the transition relief for the inaccuracy penalty. And also, even if a penalty applies for late filing, you may get penalty relief under the general IRS rule that you can show the failure to file or to file on time was due to reasonable cause and not willful neglect. So let's talk first about which employers are required to do the information reporting for 2015 and which are not. So only large employers, or ALEs, applicable large employers, are required to report. And that means generally employers who had 50 or more full-time employees or full-time equivalents. And you always determine the employer size for 1 year by counting the average number of full-time employees and full-time equivalents in the prior calendar year. So for example, to determine whether you're a large employer in 2015, you're counting your FTEs and FTEs in 2014. And I'm not really going to go through that in this presentation, but you need to calculate using the ACA method. So it's, it might not be the same method as what every employer might use to count the number of employees. So we do have an article on it at this link, and we have Excel spreadsheets available, which you'd have to get from your Leavitt advisor. That's an internal link. And again, if you've tuned in a little late, this webinar is being recorded, and also I will post the PowerPoint. So if you want to get a copy of the PowerPoint afterward, please contact your Leavitt advisor, and they will be sending those out. Now, still staying on employer size, there are 3 categories. If you had fewer than 50 full-time employees and full-time employee equivalents in 2014, then you don't need to comply with the employer mandate in 2015, and you're not subject to information reporting for 2015. If you had 50 to 99 employees and full-time equivalents, if you qualify for the delayed effective date, then you don't have to comply with the employer mandate in 2015, but you do still have to do the information reporting for 2015. So there is this 50 to 99 transition relief, which I'll talk about a little later, but probably most employers with 50 to 99 employees will qualify for it, but some may not. So you do need to do the worksheet to see if you qualify. Hopefully you did that last year. And then the last category, if you had 100 or more, then you do have to comply with the employer mandate in 2015, and you do information reporting in 2015. And of course, you're doing the forms right now in 2016, but it's for the 2015 calendar year. So next, let's look at which employees should get 1095-Cs and which do not get 1095-Cs, because I've had a lot of questions on that from people. So employees who worked full-time all 12 months need to get a 1095-C if you're an applicable large employer. And they need to get it whether or not you offered them coverage, whether or not the employee enrolled in coverage, and even if you only offered insured coverage. So if you offered insured coverage, they will get a 1095-B from the insurer, but they also need to get a 1095-C from you. The second category of employees who should get 1095-Cs is employees who worked full-time for at least 1 month of the calendar year, even if it was only 1 month, or if it was 2 months, or 10 months. So, and again, that's whether or not you offered them coverage, whether they enrolled or they declined the coverage, and even if they were employed by you for less than 12 months, but if they were full-time for at least 1 month. There is an exception, which I'll talk about on a later slide, if a full-time employee was in their limited non-assessment period all year long, which maybe, well, I'll wait till the example. And then the third category of employees who should get 1095-Cs are employees who worked part-time some or all of the months and they enrolled in self-insured group health plan coverage that you offered. So if you have a self-insured plan, you offered it to part-time, some part-time or all part-time employees, as well as full-time employees, then for any of the part-time employees who enrolled, even if it was only for part of the year, you need to give them a 1095-C. Now here's a question that came up, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I've talked to several different vendors and gotten different answers. If there's an ongoing variable hour employee who worked less than 1,560 hours in 2014, so in 2015 they're in their measurement period, and also in 2015, let's say they'd be in another they'd be in their stability period from 2014. They wouldn't be considered a full-time employee based on 2014, but they're in their measurement period in 2015, and they worked less than 130 hours for 11 months in 2015, but they worked more than 130 hours for 1 month in 2015. Should that employee get a 1095-C? And does that answer yes or no? Well, the problem is, if you give such an employee a 1095-C, what codes would go in line 14 and 16? So line 14 would be 1H, no offer of coverage for all 12 months, assuming you didn't offer coverage. And then what will you put in line 16? Well, for the 11 months that the employee did not work 130 hours, worked less than 130 hours, then 2B would go there. But indicating the employee was not full-time. But for the 1 month that the employee did work 130 hours, if 2B also goes there, then there wouldn't be any reason to give the employee a 1095-C, because you'd be showing that they're a part-time employee for each month. But if it's not 2B, then it would look like the employer would be liable for a penalty if the employee went to the exchange and qualified for a subsidy. Actually, the employer should not be penalized, but there doesn't appear to be a code for this. So I don't have an answer for that for you, but if you have someone in that situation, check with your vendor. And again, I've talked to several of them, and they seem to be handling it differently. Some said they wouldn't issue a 1095-C for that person, and others said they would, and they would count the employee as full-time for that 1 month. So, secondly, what employees should not get 1095-Cs? Well, again, employees who work part-time for all 12 months and were not offered coverage, or they were, but they didn't enroll. So those people would not get 1095-Cs. Also, if you have a new hire, any new hires who are in their limited non-assessment period for the entire year, or for all the months that they were employees. For example, if you have a full-time employee who's hired November 1st, and they're in a waiting period November 1st to December 31st, then you would not, the instructions say you don't have to give them a 1095-C, indicating that they're in their limited non-assessment period in November or December. Also, if you have a variable hour employee who was hired January 1st, 2015, and you have a 12-month measurement period, so the entire year they were in their 12-month measurement period, it's likely that initially we said you would code that for those months, for all those months that no coverage was offered, but they were in the limited non-assessment period, 2D for line 16. But the instructions say you don't have to do that. I'm not sure what each of the different vendors are doing. So if you have someone in that situation, you might check with your vendor and see how that person's being coded. Also, a third category of employees who do not get 1095-Cs are employees who worked part-time all 12 months and enrolled in insured coverage. And they'll get a 1095-B from the insurer, but you don't have to give them a 1095-C. However, if it's a part-time employee and they enrolled in self-funded coverage, if you have a self-funded offering, then you would give them 1095-Cs. A couple other questions I've had on insured versus self-insured, and I've kind of said these, but I just want to stress it. If an employer only offers insured coverage, does the employer have to furnish 1095-Cs? And the answer is yes, under Internal Revenue Code 6056. As I said, the employee will also get a 1095-B from the carrier, and that's Internal Revenue Code section 6055. But the reporting requirement is also on the employer, even if you offer insured coverage. And if you're self-insured, you have to provide both the 1095-C and the 1095-B to employees and enrolled dependents and spouses. And the answer is no, you can provide just the 1095-C and complete Part 3. And that's where you list the enrolled dependents in Part 3, but you do need to list the dependent Social Security numbers. So it appears that you need their Social Security numbers, and if you don't have them, then you have to use 1095-B. Although it may be that if it's only the dependents, you can use their date of birth. And this is a little graphic I've used the last 2 years probably, just kind of showing the different forms and who has to give what to whom. So if a person's in the exchange or marketplace, then the marketplace is going to give the individual a 1095-A, and they're going to file that with the IRS. The MEC providers, which would be the insurer or the plan, need to tell who is enrolled in the coverage. So they're going to give a 1095-B to the enrollee, and they're going to give the 1094-B to the IRS. And then group health plan sponsors are going to give a 1095-C to the enrollee, and they're going to send the 1094-C to the IRS with the 1095-Cs attached, with copies of that, and same thing with the 1094-Cs. And then the individuals is going to file with the IRS their 1040 or 1040A or 1040EZ, and the individual does not have to file the 1095C or the 1095B or the 1095A, but they can use that information to determine for what month they were eligible for a subsidy and what to show what months they had coverage. And then they'll file also an 8962 or 8965 to show if they had a reason they didn't have to have individual coverage or that they did qualify for the subsidy. So here's some different scenarios on if we're employers and employees, different categories, and this affects the different filing. And actually, before I do this, let me see if I can see if there are any questions that have come up. There are some questions. Let me figure out if I can, give me just a minute, see if I can figure out how to make these larger so I can see them. I know there was a way to do this. Would we be in compliance if we gave all employees a 1095C, even if we didn't have to give them a 1095C? That's a good question. I guess you would. I don't think there's anything that prohibits you from giving, like a part-time employee, a 1095C. So I guess you could be giving a part-time employee who wasn't in coverage. I mean, I guess there's no reason why you couldn't give everyone a 1095C, even if you didn't have to give them a 1095C. Let me see what the next one is. If we have less than 50 full-time employees, do we need to send out 1095Cs? Good question. Two parts to that answer. One is you're looking at not just 50 full-time employees, but 50 full-time employees and full-time equivalents. So we have a Leavitt 4-step process, and the first step is, and you can get the handout from your Leavitt advisor, the first step is calculating the number of employees you have using the ACA method to see if you have more or fewer than full-time, 50. But it's full-time employees and full-time equivalents. And full-time equivalents are, part-time employees, and you add up their hours and divide by 120. So if you do have fewer than 50 full-time employees and full-time equivalents, generally you do not have to send out 1095Cs, but the exception is if you have a self-insured plan, then you do have to send out 1095Cs, or you could send 1095Bs, because the plan itself has to send those out. If you have fewer than 50 employees, you probably don't have a self-insured plan. However, the exception is a level-funded plan is a self-insured plan. So if you have a level-funded plan, then you do need to send out 1095Cs. And the carrier, or TPA, may only be sending out 1095Bs, not 1095Cs. Let's see. This says, do I know the PowerPoint has vanished? Hopefully it'll be back up in just a sec. Let's see. Okay, hopefully the PowerPoint is back up now. Unfortunately, I have to switch between screens, and so the PowerPoint vanishes when I go to check on the questions. Jessica, can you let me know, is the PowerPoint back up now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the different scenarios, one would be, and I'm going to go through these because these are the questions I've gotten kind of fit with this. An employer is an ALE for all 12 months. An employer is an ALE and has non-calendar year relief. This is the first year that the employer is an ALE. The fourth one is the employer has 50 to 99 employees and qualifies for that transitional relief, so they're not really an ALE. And then just another slide on the self-funded all year or self-funded part of the year. And then the different employee situations are the person was a full-time employee all 12 months and they enrolled in coverage. Or the person was a full-time employee for 12 months, but they enrolled for fewer than 12 months. The next permutation is the person was an employee for all 12 months, but they were full-time for fewer than 12 months. The next one is the employee was hired or fired during the year. And the last one is the person was not an employee for any month. So here's the easy scenario. And that's 1 and 7. So my numbers refer to those numbers on the chart, and I will pull up that chart again. The employer is an ALE for 12 months, and the employee is full-time for all 12 months, and enrolled in the plan or declined to enroll. And there I put the information, but here you can look at it, how it would look on line 14, 15, and 16. So the easiest one, of course, is the employee gets a qualifying offer all 12 months, and the employee enrolls. So line 14 is 1A, line 15 is blank, line 16 is 2C. The next one is the employee gets a qualifying offer but doesn't enroll. Line 14 is 1A, line 15 is still blank, and line 16 is 2G, that the employee, which is indicating that it was an unaccepted offer where the federal poverty guideline safe harbor was met. So if all your employees fit in these categories, it would be easy, and none of you would even be at my webinar because you'd be done. But we know that many employees do not fit into these categories. So the kind of easy scenario, the second one, the employee received an offer, but it was not a qualifying offer, but the employee did enroll, or the employee received an offer that's not a qualifying offer and the employee declined. So I'm going to use, and let me jump ahead one slide and then I'm going to come back. The Series 1 indicator codes for line 14. So again, 1A is the qualifying offer, and I think you probably all know these codes by now, but just to remind people, for my example, I'm going to use 1E, that the employer provided minimum value coverage to the employee and at least minimum essential coverage to dependents and spouse. And then 1H would be no offer of coverage. And 1A is the qualifying offer. B, C, and D are offers of coverage, but only to the employee or only to the employee and dependents or employee and spouse. And then 1E is to the whole family. So those are, I'm just using the 1E as my example because most employers are offering coverage to the employee and family members. And I'm using it as an example, $190 is the cost. So it's not meeting the federal poverty level. And then if the employee enrolls, you'd put 2C because the 2C trumps any other codes that might apply. But if the employee does not enroll, you offer it. It's still 1E. It's $190 a month. And you put the dollars and the cents. And then in line 16, this would be 2F if the $190 meets the W-2 safe harbor. And if it meets the rate of pay safe harbor, then it would be 2H. And I'll show you the 2 series codes in just a minute. So there are several different codes that might go in line 16 if the employee declines coverage. If none of the codes apply, then you would leave it blank. It's okay to leave line 16 blank, but you don't want to leave it blank because if a code applies, you don't want to leave it blank, because if the employee goes to the marketplace and gets a subsidy, then you'll have a penalty for that month, a 4980HB penalty just on that employee for that month. So I've got a separate slide on that in I think 3 more slides. But so you want to be able to put something in there. So it's 2C if the person enrolls, and it might be 2F, G, or H if they don't enroll, or 2D if they're in a limited non-assessment period. But if you have to, then you leave it blank. But if they don't enroll, but it does meet one of the safe harbors, if the cost meets one of the safe harbors, then you want to put a code in line 16. So here are, again, the codes, the indicator codes for line 14. And I will be coming back a little later to talk about the qualifying offer transition relief, 1I. And so I'll deal with that, and I have several slides on that later on. And then the Series 2, the indicator codes for line 16, what line 16 does is it protects the employer if the employee didn't enroll, or 2C says the employee enrolled. So, but 2A, the employee was not employed during any day of the applicable calendar month. 2B, the employee was not a full-time employee and didn't enroll in coverage if it was offered. And so that is for your part-time employee. 2D, the employee was in their limited non-assessment period, but they were offered minimum value coverage at the end of the limited non-assessment period. And so there are several different categories of limited non-assessment period, and I'll be talking about those as I go through different slides. 2E is the multi-employer interim relief rule. So, and that if an employee is offered coverage through a multi-employer plan. 2F, G, and H are unaccepted offers where the employee declines coverage, but the coverage actually met one of the 3 affordability safe harbors. So that's where those codes would go. And then 2I is non-calendar year transition relief, applies for this employee. And I'll talk about what exactly that requires in several more slides. But notice that 1I and 2I do not match up. So just because they're both transition relief, but they're different types of transition relief. So just because you put 1I in line 14 does not mean that you would put 2I in line 16. Okay, so one of the questions I've gotten from people is, what if an employee declines the coverage offered? And I think I've just kind of beat that dead horse, but the question was, we have many employees who decline our coverage because they have other coverage. What code should we put in line 16, or should we just leave it blank? And again, you can leave it blank if no code applies, but then you might have to end up paying penalties. So if a code applies, you want to put that in, like the 2, F, G, or H, if it was an unaccepted amount that met a rate of a safe harbor, an affordability safe harbor, or 2B if the employee was not full-time. Now we get to the scenarios that aren't quite as easy, and I've had more questions on these. So if the employer, so it's 1 and 8 on my little chart, the employer was an ALE all 12 months, and the employee is full-time all 12 months, but was enrolled in the plan for less than 12 months. So possible reasons, maybe there are others, but common ones, the employee was in a waiting period or a limited non-assessment period for some of the time, and then the employee enrolled, or the employee enrolled and then dropped coverage. And this particularly might be the case if you have a non-calendar year plan, and say it starts April 1st, the employee was enrolled, and then January, February, March, and then they dropped coverage as of April 1st. The third one might be if the employer offered coverage late, and in that case you could end up with penalties in some of the months. So generally, if the employee is in a waiting period and then enrolled, line 14 would be 1H when you don't offer coverage, and then 1A to E once it's offered. Line 15 is blank if line 14 is 1H or 1A, and then it's a dollar amount otherwise. And the dollar amount is the employee cost for the lowest cost employee-only coverage that's offered. And then line 16, again, is the one that would vary. It's 2C while the employee is enrolled, or it's 2D while the employee is in their waiting period or limited non-assessment period, and then other 2 codes if the employee is not enrolled. So, for example, if there's a waiting period in January and February, and the employee enrolls March 1st, then in January and February, line 14 is 1H, and line 16 is 2D, showing that the employee is in their limited non-assessment period. And then starting in March and through the rest of the year, again, let's assume the employer offers family coverage and the cost is $190 a month. The cost is $190 a month for employee-only coverage. And so those months would all be 1E. Then line 15 would be 190. And then if the employee enrolls, that's 2C, because 2C trumps everything else. But what if it's the same waiting period and then the employee does not enroll? So lines 14 and 15 are still the same. And line 16, the 2D could, line 16 for March could still be 2D, because even if your waiting period was only 2 months, the limited non-assessment period that's allowed under the law is 3 months. So you get a pass for March where it's still the limited non-assessment period, and you, the employer, would not be subject to a penalty. Now then, starting in April, the limited non-assessment period is over. But for example, I have 2F, but that would apply if the employee's W-2 Box 1 amount is at least $24,000. Or if the rate of pay safe harbor was at least $24,000, then you would have 2H instead of 2F, because those are the protection codes that protect you, that shows $190 a month was affordable. It met one of the affordability safe harbors. However, if it didn't meet the affordability safe harbor, if the employee's the W-2 amount or the rate of pay was $18,000 or $20,000 or anything under 24, you would end up having to leave these blank, which means you could be subject to a potential penalty, because then it's showing that it was not affordable for the employee, so they could go to the exchange and qualify for a subsidy. So the second example, still in the employee is a full-time employee for 12 months, but enrolled for less than 12 months, is what if the employee was enrolled and then, say, January to June, so there's 1E, 1E, there's the dollar amount, there's 2C, the employee was enrolled. Now July 1, you have a new plan year, and the employee declines coverage. You've still got 1E throughout for line 14 for the whole year because you offered it. You've still got a dollar amount in line 15, although it's likely that maybe your dollar amount increased. Maybe it's $200 or $195 starting in July. I've just kept it the same to make it easy. And then for it from July on would be 2F, again, if the amount was at least $24,000, or 2H if it was if that was the rate of pay safe harbor was $24,000. So I've just left the 2's in there. But if none of those apply, then it would be just be blank. And I didn't catch it, but this one I was going to try to give a different example. So never mind on the second one. So the not so easy scenario number 4, and this is 1 and 9 from my original one. The employer is an ALE all 12 months, and the employee is an employee all 12 months, but is full-time less than 12 months. So this would be the employee changed from part-time to full-time mid-year, or from full-time to part-time. And that, for example, January to June, the employee was part-time and not offered coverage. So then you'd have 1H in line 14. Line 15 would be blank. And you'd have 2B in line 16 because the employee was part-time. And then in July to December, the employee was full-time and enrolled. So then, assuming you're offering coverage as of the date they become full-time, in this first example, there's no waiting period. So then it's 1E, and it could be 1A if it's a qualifying offer, or it could be 1B, C, or D. I've just tried to make it a little simpler and not have so many different codes. I'm using 1E and $190 when it's offered. And then, since the employee enrolled, it would be 2C for the months the employee enrolled. The second example, it's the same in the first half. The employee's part-time, so coverage isn't offered. And then in July to August, coverage is not offered because the employee is in a waiting period or limited non-assessment period. So it's still 1H. What protects the employer is the 2D. And then let's say in September to December, you offered family coverage, here's the amount, and the employee enrolled. One thing I want to point out, because I've had this as a question, is what if this amount were $300 in line 15 and it didn't meet any safe harbor? If the employee enrolls, it doesn't matter because 2C trumps it, so it doesn't matter if it doesn't meet an affordability safe harbor if the employee enrolls. You're just at risk if it doesn't meet an affordability safe harbor and the employee does not enroll, and then if they qualify and to get a subsidy in the exchange. So now I've got not as easy scenario 4B. Still, the employee is an employee all 12 months, but full-time for less than 12 months. And so the other situation I had was, what if it's an ongoing employee, they're full-time, they were enrolled, so January through June, we have 1E, $190, 2C, and then they switch to part-time, July to December, and they're offered COBRA, so they lost their regular coverage. So I used to have some different slides on this, but right now, the IRS website says, unless it just changed this morning before this, I just checked yesterday, the answer to this question is currently being revised. Please check back later for the updated response. Hopefully they're going to have something in there. They're going to have their updated response before December 31st. But that's what the answer is right now. But if you have something else in there based on the question and answer 16, 17 that the IRS used to have on their website, or based on the information before that they used to have on in their instructions, so which perhaps your outside provider was designed their system based on the instructions that the IRS used to have issued. So if you have something in there, that should be fine. If you've already given out, distributed the 1095-Cs, or they're already completed and you haven't distributed them, but you're just done with it and you don't want to have to change it again, you're fine with that, because again, the IRS is not going to be imposing any inaccuracy penalties this year. I would guess that they're not even going to really be checking if it was good faith, would be my guess. I mean, if you just randomly check boxes, then you could end up with a penalty. But I would guess if you put something in good faith, then you're going to be fine. So let me check again if there are any questions. And sorry, but my screen will probably disappear again. With line 15, I'm understanding correctly that the employee-only coverage cost, not the cost of the entire family. Yes, line 15, the affordability test is the employee cost for employee-only coverage, and the least expensive available. So even if you have two options, if one of them meets an affordability test, then that's fine, as long as that option is actually available to the employee. So even if the employee is actually getting family coverage, it's all that you're looking at is the affordability test is still based on the employee-only cost. Can you please send a copy of the PowerPoint, I think. Just to repeat for those of you who got in late, we will be posting the PowerPoint. I was making some corrections to it even just this morning, so I didn't end up posting it beforehand, and I apologize. I usually do get it posted the night before. So contact your Leavitt advisor or send an email, and then your Leavitt advisor will send out the PowerPoints afterwards. And what is a level funded plan? I don't want to go into that here, but it's sort of a hybrid between so here's a brief explanation. It's kind of a hybrid between an insured plan and a self-insured plan, and the employer pays a level amount each month. So that amount is set at the beginning of the year, and then at the end of the year, the employer could end up owing more if the assumptions on what we thought the amount would be, not we, but the insurer or TPA thought the amount would be if the claims are actually much higher than that. So some employers are kind of going into self-funded plans or level-funded plans, but I just want to make sure that you're clear that those are self-funded for purposes of information reporting and for other purposes. Another question, if the employer is in a partially self-funded plan, do we follow the insured or self-funded rules? So that, if it's self-funded at all, you're going to be following the self-funded rules, and that's probably the level-funded plan. Let me see, do I have another? Okay, so There we go. We're back to the PowerPoint. Oops. So not as easy scenario number 5 is if the employer was an ALE all year, and then the employee was hired or fired during the year. So for example, if the employee was hired July 1st, then before that, you'd have 1H. Do I have a picture? Yes. 1H until the employee was hired. Here, I'll go back up. And then that would be blank, and then line 16, it would depend on whether they enrolled or not. If the employee was fired July 1st and was offered COBRA, then you're back to the same thing as in the prior slide. The IRS website says the answer to this question is currently being revised. Please check back later for an updated response. So that applies for COBRA for someone who's an employee for part of the year and then is terminated, or who's full-time for part of the year and enrolled and then goes to part-time. So, for example, if the person's hired July 1st and offered coverage September 1st, then you've got 1H from January through August, and then let's say September 1st, the employer offered the family coverage again, 1E. The employee cost for employee-only coverage is still 190, but line 16 is what varies. It's 2A when the person is not an employee, then it's 2D while they're in their limited non-assessment period or waiting period, and then it's 2C once the person enrolls. Okay, scenario 5B, if the person was hired full-time November 1st, so they're actually in their waiting period in November and December, then it would be different. You'd still have 1H the whole year. You wouldn't have anything in line 15. Line 16 would be 2A through October, and then it would be 2D, limited non-assessment period. But the instructions say there's no need to furnish a 1095-C to an employee who was in their limited non-assessment period for all of the year or wasn't an employee. So you could probably do it either way in this case. You could issue the 1095-C to the employee and have 2D in November, December, or you could just not issue them a 1095-C. But to the question that someone asked earlier, if you wanted to just issue it, that would be fine. I don't think there wouldn't be any penalty for issuing it. And then the first and last months of employment, there are special rules in the instructions for like the first month of employment, and I've had questions on all 3 of these, so that's why I've included this little matrix. If coverage did not start on the first day of the month, like the person's hired on the 10th, then you'd have to put 1H in line 14 because in order to be an offer of coverage, it has to be offered for every day of the month. And then if line 14 was 1H, then line 15 would be blank, and line 16 could be 2D, that the employee was in their limited non-assessment period. For an employee who terminates, these next to an employee who terminates employment mid-month, but if they're offered regular active coverage through the end of the month, then for the month in which they terminate, you'd still have the regular code, 1A or whatever applied, because it was offered for every day of the month. If line 14 was 1A, then 15 would be blank. Otherwise, it would be the lowest employee cost for self-only coverage, like I've been putting $190 in my examples. And then 2C, if the employee stays enrolled through the month. If they dropped coverage mid-month, I don't know why they would, but if for some reason they did, they started a new job and took that coverage, then you would have 2F or G or H as applicable, or blank if nothing applied. And the last example is an employee who terminates employment mid-month and the coverage terminates on the date of employment termination. So then, like this one, it would be 1H because it wasn't offered every day of the month. Line 14 would be blank. And the employee would be 2B for the month of termination, not a full-time employee all month and not enrolled. Not as easy scenario number 6. An ALE, but the individual was not an employee for any month of the year. So examples of that would be someone who was an employee in 2013 and 14. They terminated in 2014, but they were on COBRA for all of 2015. or a non-employee who was on COBRA coverage, or on coverage, like an outside director who had coverage, a family member of a former employee who's on COBRA, but the employee isn't. So that how you code it is going to depend on whether it's self-funded or not. So if it's a non-employee and they're on COBRA for all 12 months, and it's a self-insured plan, then you're going to code it, line 14 would be 1G, and 15 and 16 would be blank. And this is the site to the IRS webpage. And then if it's a former employee who was, so here's this one, those would be blank, but you do report it on Part 3 if it's self-insured. And if it's insured, and it's a former employee or a non-employee who's on COBRA in an insured plan for all 12 months, then you would not report it. You would not issue a 1095-C. The person would get a 1095-B from the insurer, but you would not be issuing them a 1095-C because they're not an employee. One other thing I want to talk about just for a few slides, there are different kinds of transition relief, and different kinds get reported in different parts of the 1094-C and 1095-C. So some of the questions I've gotten are about were employers who wanted to check certain boxes, but it was for the wrong kind of transition relief. So for example, there's the 50 to 99 employees transition relief, where you're not subject to employer mandate until 2016 if you qualify. There's the 100-plus transition relief, where if there's a penalty, you get to offset 80 rather than 30 in the penalty calculation. And these two kinds of transition relief, you check box C on line 22 of the 1094-C. And then also on the 1094-C, you would check line 23, column E, and it would be either A or B, depending on which transition relief. A third type of transition relief is for 2015, you can offer coverage to at least 70%, I should say more than, not less than, of full-time employees in 2015, and now in 2016 it's 95%. But if you met that transition relief, that would just go on Form 1094-C, lines 23 to 35, column A. So that would not be checking line 22, box C. Then a fourth kind of transition relief is non-calendar year plan transition relief, which means if you qualify, you would not be subject to the employer shared responsibility until the first day of the 2015 plan year, rather than January 1st. And if you qualify for that, that would be on, you would check the box on 1094-C, lines 23 to 25, column A, and 1095-C, line 16, you would use the code 2I. Then there's also transition relief, first payroll period in January for 2015 only. So if you didn't offer someone coverage until the first payroll period rather than January 1st, that would be fine. And that would be line 16, 2I also. And then there's qualifying offer transition relief 2015, which is a reporting method. And if you use that, it would be, and I'm going to go over these in the next few slides, the 1094-C, line 22, box C, and on the 1095-C, you would use 1I on line 14. So you can see with the different types of transition relief that you would be checking different boxes. So I'm not going to go over these two. I put in a slide that on what you have to do to qualify for the 50 to 99 transition relief, and then also the non-calendar year transition relief. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. Two of the areas I've had questions on, particularly, there's confusion about the qualifying offer and the qualifying offer method transition relief for 2015. And secondly, I've had questions about the 50 to 99 transition relief and the qualifying offer transition relief 2015. So the second one is the simplest. Let me just cover that. The transition relief for an employer with 50 to 99 employees is different than the qualifying offer transition relief. So if you qualify for the 50 to 99, then that's where on Form 1094C you check box C on line 22, and then on line 23, in column E, you would put A. And there we go. So here's the 1094C. You would check this box C, and then in E, you would put A. In column E, you would put A. That's for the 50 to 99 transition relief. Now let me talk for a few slides about the difference between a qualifying offer and the qualifying offer reporting method. So a qualifying offer is for a particular employee, and the requirements are that you offer minimum essential coverage that provides at least minimum value, and the minimum value, the affordability test that it has to meet is the federal poverty level affordability test. So the employee cost for self-only coverage cannot exceed, for 2015, it was actually 9.56% of the federal poverty level. And you offer it to one or more full-time employees, and it also has to include an offer of minimum essential coverage to the employee's spouse and dependents. Now that is different from the qualifying offer method. So the qualifying offer method is that the employer makes a qualifying offer for all calendar months of the year to an employee for all calendar months that the employee was a full-time employee and for whom the 4980H penalty could apply. So when the employee is in their limited non-assessment period, the penalty would not apply. So when they're in their limited non-assessment period, you don't have to make them a qualifying offer. The qualifying offer method transition relief for 2015 is different from this first one, and it's easier than the qualifying offer method. It's a little easier method for 2015 only. The employer makes a qualifying offer, but it doesn't have to be offered to a full-time employee for all of the calendar months that the 4980H penalty would apply. So the qualifying offer transition relief, the employer made the qualifying offer for one or more months of 2015 to at least 95% of its full-time employees. But for the other 5% of employees, the issue is what box do you check? So those other 5% might be employees who did not receive any offer of coverage, or they might have received an offer of coverage but not a qualifying offer, like maybe it was 1E in line 14, not 1A, or they received a qualifying offer for less than 12 months. So you can still code for those employees if you check that you're using the qualifying offer method transition relief for 2015. So on you would check line for the 1095C for these other 5% of employees, you would have code 1I, and then line 15 would be blank. And then on the 1094C, on line 22, you would check box B, but you would not put A or B on line 23, column E. So for the other kinds of transition relief, the 50 to 99 and the 100 plus for the penalties, you would put something in column E. You'd put A or B. But for this kind of transition relief, you would not. And this, there's more information on page 7 of the instructions if you want. So the qualifying offer transition relief, here's what the 1095C would look like. For the 95% of employees that you did make the qualifying offer to, it would be 1A and blank and 2C. But for the 5% of employees who did not get a qualifying offer, or maybe it's only 3%, but whatever the amount of, line 14 would be 1I, and 15 would be blank, and 16 would be blank. And again, it would be page 7 of the instructions. So here we are back to the different scenarios. Now let me go back to a few more of those since I've digressed on the other ones. So now I'm looking at not as easy scenarios. Number 2, the employer is in ALE all 12 months but qualifies for the non-calendar year relief. So we're getting there. I'm getting close to the end here. If the employer plan year starts July 1st, 2015, and the employer did not offer coverage to some or all full-time employees in January to June, so we've got 1H for January to June, but did offer minimum value affordable coverage as of July 1st. And that could be, in my example, they're offering it to the employee and family, and we're going to assume it meets the rate of pay safe harbor. So January to June, you've got 1H, but then what protects you is line 16, that this is 2I, which is showing that you have non-calendar year relief. Then in July, you start offering coverage. Let's say it's to the family. The rate is $190 a month. And then if the employee enrolled, it would be 2C. But if they didn't enroll, I've got 2H because that's showing that it's affordable under the rate of pay safe harbor. That 2H is the code for that. And this would be the 1095C for employees that you didn't offer coverage to in January to June. But even if you qualify for non-calendar year relief, if you did offer coverage to all or some employees in January to June, then you would put, for example, the 1E in line 14, and you'd have the dollar amount in line 15, and you'd have 2C in line 16 if the employee enrolled, or you'd have 2I if the employee did not enroll. Here's not as easy scenario number 8. So it's the employer's first year as an applicable large employer. So for January to March, it's considered the limited non-assessment period. So line 16 is 2D. So the employer gets a pass. Oops, and I see I've got this in all. It should be January, February, March, not in the all box. If this is the first year the employer is in ALE, and there are a couple other ands in here, the employee was not actually offered coverage at any point during the prior calendar year, and the employee actually is offered coverage by the first day of April at the end of the limited non-assessment period, and the employer has protection against the 4980HB penalty only if that coverage as of April 1st does actually provide at least minimum value. So the way the employer's protected, and this isn't just for 2015 if you would have been a large employer in 2014, but this wasn't in effect yet. So the way the employer is protected for the first 3 months of the calendar year in which the employer is a large employer is usually the limited non-assessment period kind of applies for the employee. But in this case, it applies, the 2D applies for the employer, that this was their first year as a large employer. Now, number 9, not as easy scenarios number 9, the employer had 50 to 99 employees and qualifies for the delay to 2016 for the employer mandate, but still has to report, excuse me, coverage, but still have to report for 2015 whether or not they offered coverage. So obviously many of our clients who are in the 50 to 99 range did offer coverage in 2015, even though they weren't required to, because they probably wouldn't have been our clients in the first place if they weren't offering any coverage. But sometimes the employer offered coverage but to less than 70% of full-time employees. For example, they had a management carve-out plan, or they might not have reported, some employers didn't offer any coverage. So you still have to do the information reporting. So, assuming that you do qualify for the transition relief, first of all, there's the 1094C and also the 1095C. The 1094C, as I've said before, is the line 22 of Part 2. You check box C, and then also in Part 3, line 23, column E, you would use the indicator code A. Then on the 1095C, you have the codes for employees who worked full-time all year, and the codes for employees who are hired mid-year but worked full-time for at least 1 month, because those are the people that you have to give 1095-Cs to. However, for employees who are only part-time or non-employees for all of 2015, then you don't have to give them a 1095-C. So here's what it looks like for if you qualify for the 50 to 99 transition relief, and you do not offer coverage, then, and the person's a full-time employee all year, you've just got 1H in line 14. And there's really nothing that's protecting you in line 16, except that on the 1094-C, you're showing that you had the transition relief. For an employee who was hired July 1st, worked part-time in July to August, and then full-time in September to December, you've still got 1H all the way across on line 14, so line 15 is blank. On line 16, you've got 2A when the person was not an employee, then 2B, because in my example they worked part-time in July and August, and then when they're full-time in September to December, either you would leave it blank, or if you're using 2015 as a measurement period to determine if it's a variable hour employee rather than a full-time employee, and you're using it to determine if they're going to be full-time for 2016, then you might use 2D in these last few months because it's counting as their measurement period. So then they'd be in their limited non-assessment period. So just a shot of the 1094-C where you'd be checking the transition relief method. And again, it would be that it's the 50 to 99 side. A couple questions on employer size and control group. Here's one of the questions I've had. There are 3 employers. Company A has 49 employees, Company B has 150, and Company C has 7. If they're separate employers, then Company B and C have to file, but Company A does not, and B and C are subject to the employer mandate. If the 3 employers are members of a control group, then the control group is an ALE, and so each member of the control group has to file, and they have to, even if they have fewer than 50 employees, and they each have to file separate 1094-Cs and 1095-Cs. So A, B, and C each have to file separately. Now, in contrast, if there's 2 separate employers and they each own 50% of a joint venture, the joint venture is not part of the control group with the other employers. So, for example, if A and B each own 50% of C, so A is only 49 employees, then A and B have separate owners. They're not part of the same control group. B and C, 150 and 70 employees, each have to file separate 1094-C and 1095-Cs, but Company A does not file 1094-Cs or 1095-Cs to employees, and A is not subject to the employer shared responsibility or employer mandate, because if it's not a control group, then even though A is part owner, A owns 50% of a company that has 70 employees and has to file, A itself does not have to file and is not subject to it. Other questions I've had on control groups: what if an employee is paid by different members of the control group? And sort of the question was, there's 4 entities in the control group, and the salaries of the officers of all the entities are paid 25% by each of the entities. Well, this is on page 13 of the final instructions, and then it also refers to the definition of employee. So if they're equally paid by each of the entities, then the entities will decide which employee to claim as employee, and only one entity claims it for each particular month. And only one counts them as an employee on the 1094-C also, and only one furnishes a 1095-C to the employee. However, in a different situation, if there's one employee who works different percentages of time for different employers in the control group in different months, then the entities have to count them differently in each month. So that would be a much larger administrative hassle. For example, if employee A worked 60%, or let's say employee number 1 worked 60% for entity A in 1 month and 40% for entity B, then entity A would claim the employee for that month. But then if the hours change each month and that same employee the next month worked 60% for entity B and 40% for entity A, then for that next month, entity B would claim the employee. So that would be a much more administrative hassle. 2 quick questions. If the employer had 100 or more employees and was self-funded all year, then the employer has to complete 1095-C Parts 1, 2, and 3. And if the employer had 100 or more employees and was insured part of the year and self-funded part of the year, the employer still has to complete the 1095-C Parts 1 and 2 for all 12 months. And then just for the months that the employer was self-funded, it would complete Part 3. So it doesn't, oh, I thought I had an example, I guess not. It doesn't not have to complete the 1095-C for the months it was insured. It would just be showing insured and self-funded. So the last part, some 1094-C questions. And then I have some examples on the forms. Line 22 says, check all that apply. But like, the question is, well, do I check all that could apply? And really the answer is no, you're only checking all that apply and that the employer is using. So you would probably check A or B, with like the qualifying offer method or the qualifying offer transition relief. Then you would also check C if it applies, the 50 to 99 transition relief or the 100 plus transition relief. I think you probably would not check B and D. D is the 98% method, although maybe there are some situations in which it would apply and you would want to use both of them. I think it usually would not, and I think maybe you could check A and D, but I think you probably wouldn't want to. So A is the qualifying offer method, D is the 98% method. And this is just a little bit more on the 98% method, on what that involves. So, and just here's the 1094-C showing the 4 boxes of what you could check. And again, the 1094-C Part 3, if you offered coverage to at least 70% in 2015 rather than 95%, that was from something I showed earlier. And a couple other questions I had were on 1094-C, the full-time employee and the total employee count. That column B, you're reporting the full-time employee count for each month of the year, and you do not include employees. In column B, you do not include employees who are in a limited non-assessment period. And if you do use the 98% offer method, then you don't have to report the number of full-time employees, so you wouldn't have to do this. Note the difference with column B and column C. Here you're reporting the total number of employees for each month, so that's full-time and non-full-time. And, oops, this one I meant to fix. And this doesn't, you do include employees in their limited non-assessment period. And this would, you're counting employees, it's either you can choose the first day of the month, the last day of the month. You can also choose the 12th day of the month. I'll add that in before I post this. Or the first day of the first payroll period, starting in the month, or the last day of the first payroll period starting in the month. But you have to do it consistently for all the months. And then in my example, I just used, like, if it's a 98% method, then you don't have to do this, but otherwise you're putting in the number of employees. And if it is a member of a control group, then if you check the control group box, you have to show which months you're part of a control group, and it could be all 12 months, or maybe it's only several of the months. And the other question I had was on listing the control group members. So then in Part 4, you would list the other members of the control group. You do need to report only the top 30 ALE members of the aggregated group, but you do need to list them by employer size based on number of employees. So, and each entity in the control group would need to name them. So if you've got like 20 different employers in the control group, you probably need to get that list, or your payroll system will provide that list, and it would be on each of the, it would be on the 1094Cs for each member of the control group, and it would change a little because whichever member's reporting wouldn't be on the list on page 4, they'd be the one who's reporting it. Okay, so I'm almost done. A couple other questions, random questions I had. Can an employee's first 3 months be coded as the limited non-assessment period, code D, even if the employer actually has a shorter 30-day waiting period? The answer is yes, but as you'll notice from the examples I gave earlier, if the employee actually enrolls, then you would put 2C. So if your waiting period is 2 months rather than 3, once the employee enrolls, you would put 2C. But if the employee doesn't enroll, then you could still put 2D for the 3rd month. Would the code 2D override the safe harbor code 2F if it were applicable for an employee? I think it would, although I think you probably could put either one. So if it was 2D, the employee was in their limited non-assessment period and the employee did not enroll, but it was a 2F or 2G or 2H, that it met one of the affordability safe harbors, what was offered met that, I think you could put either 2D or 2F, see what your system automatically defaults to. Also, in the month of termination, if the termination is before the last day of the month, so the employee is not a full-time employee for the entire month, and I showed this earlier, but if coverage would have continued until the end of the month, then it would be 2B. And I have that chart that shows the 3 termination and beginning months. And if the employee terminates on the last day of the month and was full-time, then it would not be 2B. It would be probably whatever code applied in the month before. Another question was, what if an employer keeps an employee on active coverage longer than 12 weeks of FMLA or longer than company-approved leave? What are the ramifications for the information reporting? Well, the problem is the employee is going to show on the system as an active employee. So they'll be counted in the full-time employee and total employees, the totals on 1040C in columns B and C, line 23. But if you charge the employee the full cost of coverage after 12 weeks, rather than the regular cost, then that amount is going to go on line 15. So it might show that coverage is not affordable. But if the employee's out on leave and they continue to be in the plan, then it won't really matter because they'll have line 16 will be 2C. And probably if they're out on FMLA leave for 12 weeks and then they're on medical leave, or the doctor says, well, they should be able to come back in another month, and you're a nice employer and give them another month, you just need to be careful about how it will affect your information reporting. And another question that came up is if an employee is in their initial stability period, and that would be different than your standard stability period. So if their initial stability period straddles 2 different contract years or plan years, and you have a renewal during that time, and the cost of coverage increases at renewal, say it's an April 1st renewal, then the question was, does the employee have to stay in, or do they get to pay the lower rate? Well, the answer is the employee can either pay the increased rate or can drop coverage at renewal. So they wouldn't be guaranteed the same rate if you have a contract renewal and the rate increases. And the employee is not required to continue coverage during the entire stability period. They could drop the coverage. And then just a reminder on what the 4980H penalties are, the A penalty and the B penalty. And I listed a separate slide with the limited non-assessment periods, although those were also listed in the slide that showed the Series 2 codes. So that is it. Thank you for hanging in there. And let me see, we're over our time. I will see if there are any other questions, and I'll answer questions, so if you want to stay on, you're welcome to. Again, we will have, I will post these slides shortly, so I'll make the correction to that one that had an error in it. And then if you want copies of the slides, please contact your Leavitt advisor, and they'll send them out to you. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I will go over the rest of the questions now, but I realize people may have other things to do. And let's see. So, thank you for those of you who attended, and if you want to stay on, that's fine. Can you go over what is a control group again and what's an ALE? The ALE is the applicable large employer. So that's just a large employer who had at least 50 full-time employees and full-time equivalents. A control group is when one employer or group of employers has a controlling interest over another, and it might be a parent-child subsidiary where one company owns at least 80% of another, or it might be a brother-sister company, and there are more complicated rules for that, but 5 or fewer entities own a controlling interest, at least 50% in the other entities. And you probably know if you're a control group because you are for all tax purposes, not just for these purposes. So you should have something from your tax accountant or tax attorney or corporate attorney telling you whether or not you're part of a control group. A third type is that there could be an affiliated service group. And let me see if I can get other questions. We did not offer coverage for 2015. Coverage started 1/1/16 for employees only, with the option for employees to add a family plan. Do we report that as being in a waiting period for all of 2015? Also for 2016, we were covering the cost of employee only, and actually maybe you should send me an email afterwards. It sounds like it's a little complicated, but if you didn't offer coverage in 2015, if you meet the qualifications for a employer 50 to 99 size that has a delayed effective date, then you would be fine. You would check that on 1094-C. But if you had at least 100 employees, then that's going to be an issue for you, because then you're subject to potential penalties in 2015. Let's see, control group. If self-insured, you need to enter the employee's Social Security or number or date of birth, or employee and all covered dependents. If you're self-insured, you do need to enter the Social Security number or date of birth for all covered dependents, not just the employee. And that looks like it's it. That's it on the questions. So if you do have additional questions, contact your Leavitt advisor. And thank you very much for attending. And I will post the PowerPoint shortly.